Interesting stuff here. Very interesting stuff is going on with wage growth versus inflation growth. So it's like inflation goes up, it makes life more expensive. Gas goes up in price, comes down in price. But sometimes things at the grocery store go up in price and they don't come back. Milk went down. Remember they were talking about eggs for a long time 2 years ago being really expensive. And if you owned a dozen eggs, you were rich. And all those memes that went out about that. Well, other things at the grocery store and basic things have not come down. And that's an example of inflation is down and they say, oh, it's great, energy is down. And it is great that energy is down. It is great that natural gas and gasoline and fuel oil prices are back down as we're in the middle of winter now here in the United States. And that takes a lot of pressure off of consumers, especially the Midwest and the Northeast. Northeast especially, a lot of cities back there still use fuel oil in their heaters. And so when that's up in price, it makes it very expensive, especially if people are retired up there. So some things come back down, which is good, but other things go up and don't come back down. Coffee and other things went up in price or still up in price, and that's permanent inflation effect. So on the other side, you're like, well, when do I get my raise, and does my income kind of follow that or chase it? Well, let's take a look. We're going to pop up this first chart. This is average hourly earnings percent going up as represented by the blue line, and inflation represented by the orange line. And isn't it interesting, from 2016 to 2020, inflation stayed, 2% was a peak in 18, 19, end of 2020. And then we all know what happened at the very end of 2020, going through 2021, inflation went crazy. Everything went up. All the stuff I was just talking about went up, and it was very hard on Americans. Well, the other side of it was what happened to earnings. Well, during COVID, we had a spike in earnings. And remember, because we had a little bit of a shortage of labor, and so people were like going into their boss and saying, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to go work for this company because I can work from home, bring my dog to work. See what I did there? Your dog is already home. And go through all that, and there was a wage spike, and there was like a situation where people were demanding and getting sudden raises. So for part of 2020, we had this big spike in wages. But then we had, going end of 2021, we had wages not going up as people were coming back to work. Work from home, suddenly became work from here, meaning your desk. And many companies started asking people to come back, 3 days, 4 days a week. You heard that from Disney, you heard it from Amazon. And hey, we want to check it out. We heard other people like Google saying, hey, we're using some systems to check on people to make sure you're actually working from home. But other people are saying, nah, all this stuff about productivity at home, maybe somebody is productive at home if they're just processing things, like processing insurance policies. Okay, maybe you are more productive from home, maybe. But other people came out, such as Verizon Media, and there was a guy, his name was Tim Armstrong, I think it was. Verizon Media comes out and says, hey, now people are complaining about get promoted. And I'm like, how do I promote you if you're working from home and you're not bonding with your team and you're not lifting them up? How does that work? And all that madness going back and forth, that was all affecting wages, and wages stopped growing so much. So then you see the inflation spike. So when it all sorts out, right now, inflation is back down. The amount of inflation is below the growth in wages. Wages are a little bit above, which means that's the way it was from 2016, 17, 18, and 19, that the inflation rate, which was under 2% at those days, maybe a little bit over, and the hourly earnings was staying a little bit ahead of that, which meant that Americans were marginally staying ahead of the game. Maybe. Remember, this is a cumulative effect. Gasoline goes up, comes back down. Milk may go up, but it comes back down. But a lot of other things go up in expense and they stay at their new level, which means if your wage didn't come up, you're no longer able to afford it. So check out this next chart. What I did is I went and dug into, and we found from the St. Louis Fed, we found the following. Take a look at this from 2019 all the way to 2023. So the average hourly wage, and remember, this is everybody. So this may seem high. This is not like minimum wage, but the average wage in America was $34.27 an hour right now. And if you go back to 2020, it was, 28, I think beginning of 2020, you can see on this chart, I think the actual number was $28.75 an hour. So it's gone $28.75 to $34.27, up about 19%. Then I did an inflation calculator. So if wages went up about 19% from $28.75 to $34.27 per hour, average for everybody, from minimum wage people all the way up to salary people, that's a national average. Okay, 19% during that time. But what did inflation do? Guess what? Inflation also went up 19%. So that if $100 in January 2020 would have cost you $119 in November of 2023, the last month, right at the end of last year, because we're right here at the beginning of January. So that's a recent stat, because it takes time for the government to get this together. It takes time for the government to get a lot of shit together. But anyway, it's also 19%. But then I dug in a little deeper, and I don't have a chart for that, but I'm going to show you what I found out. I found out that, okay, 19% to everybody, but how did that affect like people making less than 50 grand a year? And I found out that 50 grand is about the number where half of America makes 50 grand a year or less, with a nominal mean in there of about $38,000. Because remember, there's a lot of minimum wage students, there's a lot of people working part-time, but half of America makes less than 50 grand a year. And I found that the half of America that made less than 50 grand a year, they didn't benefit like this. Their wages are only up for that sector, as I like to say, that cohort, which is a fancy name for a group of people, was only up about 15%. Aha, that means that inflation is ahead of them and was ahead of them by 4 or 5 points, but that doesn't count everything, because certain people get hit differently. People that commute a long way get hit harder on gasoline. People that live in the Northeast get hit harder on fuel oil, on the energy side, and those fortunately are coming down. But what it says is that the American worker, half the United States, is behind the curve on wage growth versus inflation. So when you hear on TV that they're saying, oh, well, wage growth is finally ahead of inflation, it may be ahead of inflation now, but you have to look at what was the total effect. And over those 3 years, what amount of increase in income did those people get versus the permanent inflation on things that aren't coming back down in price? And guess what? The American worker is behind. And let's take a look at this. $1 trillion in credit card debt was crossed in October. I think it was mid-October. $1 trillion in credit card debt. During COVID, when everybody got checks from the government, it got pushed down to below half a trillion, like 500 billion. But it went zooming up as everybody went back to work and COVID was over in 2022, 2023. And now Americans in October 2023 crossed $1 trillion of credit card debt. Then they also started using BNPL, buy now, pay later. A lot of times you can click it from Best Buy, from Amazon, from a lot of places. So you don't use a credit card, you use buy now, pay later, and it's an easy credit check. It's very quick, but it doesn't show up on your credit report. And the stats have just come out. January 10th, the stats came out. 41% of the buy now, pay later since Black Friday, which is right there, that big shopping day around Thanksgiving. Guess what? The payments are late. And this is only supposed to be a 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 month, but it's supposed to be short. And the interest rate, if you're late, goes way up. You miss a payment, the interest rate goes up. It's like 50%. It's massive. It's huge. So guess what this is showing? Wage growth is behind inflation. And people revved up the credit cards after COVID, use buy now, pay later. So a lot of things we hear, hey, the stock market's up this hub. You know what? For the lower half of America, under $50,000, it's not up. It's in tough places. Why is this important for you and me? If you employ people and you have a business, there's never been a better time to help coach people on financial sanity. And they'll take a look at it and say, You know, the raises you give to people. Do you have some great workers, some great people at your company? Can you afford to give them a 5, 6, or 7% raise for good performance, but also keeping an eye on the outside world and says, man, I know people could use a little more help. If you're able to do that, then you're part of the solution and you're part of protecting the good people that are part of your company. So that's a quick economic lesson and what the realities are in front of us and how, oh my goodness, when government is feeding stats and feeding things to the media to talk about Bidenomics and how everything is coming back and how things are great, flip off your television because it's BS. The lower half of America is squeezed, it's got more credit card debt than they have, and is in a tough space. And it makes you wonder, you know, what do I invest in? What do I do?